This episode is brought to you by Appriss Retail.
How do we deliver the best possible returns experience while removing all of the fraud and abuse in the transaction? How do we add that intelligent friction just for the less than 1% of abusive and fraudulent shoppers while still preserving and actually in many, many cases improving the experience for the other 99%, right? Versus these hard, rigid rules that have a high insult and conflict rate when it comes to the way they are executed and implemented.
Welcome to this special deep dive edition of the Retail Remix podcast brought to you by Appriss Retail. I'm Adam Blair, one of the editors at Retail TouchPoints, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Now, many retailers view product returns as a necessary evil. It's just one of the costs of doing business. But those costs are climbing. It's hurting the bottom lines of both retailers and brands at a time when they're already being squeezed by tariffs and other inflationary pressures. So today we're going to take a closer look specifically at fraudulent returns and how they're making a difficult challenge even tougher, as well as some effective tools and solutions retailers can use to cut down on these types of returns and mitigate their worst effects. We'll also hear insights from a recent consumer returns report about the impacts of return policies on customer loyalty. To help guide us through our discussion of fraudulent returns today, we have Vishal Patel, the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Appriss Retail, who brings more than 15 years of experience in data science to the role. We also have Pedro Ramos, who's been Chief Revenue Officer at Appriss Retail since May 2023, and his previous jobs include VP of Sales at Agilence and Loss Prevention AVP at Pathmark Stores. So thank you both for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
All right, let's dive right into this. The real cost and scope of retail returns. How big of a challenge are returns in general? And then I guess the second part is, how much do fraudulent and abusive returns add to the problem?
Yeah, so great question, Adam. The total problem is around $685 billion a year, and it's a significant impact on total margins to the retail industry. The fraudulent and abusive part is about $103 billion. And what's interesting there, we've made a point, this is according to the Consumer Returns Report that's published by Appriss Retail and Deloitte. We've made a point of calling out abuse because that's where we see the biggest change in the returns world today. We can explore that a little bit later on.
That's quite a large number for the fraud and abuse. I mean, the returns themselves obviously are a huge challenge for retailers and brands in terms of the logistics. But let's talk about the fraudulent and abusive returns. Can you tell me what are the main types of these? How are you defining them? And why do they have such an outsized impact on profit margins and efficiencies?
Yeah, so let's talk about fraud. So fraud is although a very small percentage of the population is committing fraud, things like returning stolen merchandise is one of them. Tender laundering is another big one. These are two that we like to pick on because they're really in the purview of the professionals. And so this is where we are starting to see there's a lot of talk in the industry, retail, around organized retail crime. These are organized groups that are doing in-store shoplifting and then creating secondary supply chains to sell these stolen goods in all kinds of different channels. But what we're also seeing is this has started to permeate itself into the returns world. So particular individuals or groups of individuals, we refer to them as entities, because we frequently see the activity across multiple account numbers, loyalty numbers, credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, and so forth, all tied to a single type of transactions. And so they're traveling, so they're professionals. And what we see there is that they're stealing the product off the retailer shelves and then doing non-receipted returns against that stolen product. And they're just basically liquidating it. They are the worst when it comes to having a financial impact on retail because A, they're causing shrink with the stolen product. B, they're actually buying or selling the shrink back to the retailer. And so the retailer is now paying them cash for their own product twice. So it's doubling the shrink impact and actually lowering sales. The other part is what we're calling abuse. And I don't know if it's necessarily deliberate abuse. There's been a lot of terminologies, friendly fraud and so forth. I like to just say it's the human condition. People are just adjusting to a new world. They're more comfortable buying large bulks of products and returning large bulks quantities of product, because the digital space kind of created that level of comfort and created this new normal. And so what we see is that consumers are extending it. They're not just doing this at digital. We're now seeing this happening in store. Where that is really hurting retailers in a couple of ways. A, it's all the frictional costs with shipping product and constantly having to accept it as a return, creating out of stock conditions, where the product could be sold at full margin and is now being discounted. And we're also seeing an outsized impact on stores. So if you look at the stores, although retail sales are in the low 20% range in digital, the return rates are much lower in digital than they are in the physical stores. We're seeing, return rates in the stores as high as 78%. So there's about 5 to 7 percentage points of variance between the distribution of retail sales and return rates on digital versus in store. And so that's digital goods coming back to the stores.
Digitally purchased goods coming back to the store? Because my impression was always that with e-commerce, the return rates were higher than from store selling. But you're talking about the returns themselves.
Yeah, Adam, if you think about the pure return rate of online returns, or the way we think about it is returns that can be attributed to an online purchased good, then you're absolutely correct. The return rates are higher. But I think what's important to understand from a retailer's perspective, a lot of the times those returns are manifesting themselves in what you would call a buy online, return in store scenario, right? Think about the last time any major retailer you purchased from and you had to make a return, there likely was a store near your home and you were able to just go make that return into store. Now, where this also creates a lot of challenges sometimes for the retailer is, are those products even sold in store to begin with? Right? Because if they aren't, they are taking on additional cost of moving that product to the right location, right? What is the condition of the product, right? Is that product even sellable? So the whole spectrum that we tend to look at, right, goes from, on one extreme, you've got these organized retail crime and the professional fraudsters that Pedro talked about, right? And all the way to the other end, where this could simply be a consumer who doesn't know that they're actually inadvertently doing some type of fraud or abuse, right? And these could be examples where people are buying large TVs before Super Bowl just to watch the game and then making a return, right? Now, obviously you do that once or twice, that's the retailer takes that as just cost of doing business. But these professional fraudsters are doing that at a scale where the losses for the retailer tend to add up.
And Adam, you're absolutely right in the sense, I think we need to separate the two forms of retail. There's the direct to consumer, purely digital. And so in those examples, yes, the return rates are much, much higher because the nature of the go-to-market strategies basically require or actually create a higher return rate. When you look at omni-channel returns, which is where we excel, and we're actually one of the only companies who does it, we see that return rates in stores are far, far higher than they are in the digital channel because the consumer has another place to go make that return. And for a lot of reasons, one of which is they just may want to browse for alternatives. So we see return rates in stores that's as high as 78% of total returns, not total sales, but total returns.
Total returns, yeah. I'm flashing back to what you said a few minutes ago, Pedro, about that essentially digital commerce created this. It's hard to blame consumers for doing something that to them makes a lot of sense. And I can certainly see it, correct me if I'm wrong, as I think Vishal was saying, it's so convenient for them to go to a physical place, if indeed it's an omni-channel retailer, to be able to make that return rather than packing it, boxing it, shipping it, et cetera. Everybody knows that's a pain in the neck.
Returns are part of retail, but too many can eat into profits and frustrate customers. Appriss Retail helps retailers reduce returns with AI-powered solutions that keep the process seamless and frictionless for shoppers. Real-time insights spot abusive and fraudulent returns, protecting profits without disrupting loyal customers. Trusted by 60 of the top 100 U.S. retailers, Appriss Retail helps control returns while keeping shoppers coming back. Reduce returns, stop abuse and fraud, and protect your bottom line. Visit AprissRetail.com today.
Well, so let me ask you about What's involved in stopping or mitigating or redirecting these types of fraudulent and abusive returns? And if a retailer is able to do that, how does that help their bottom line?
Yeah, so I think you need to contrast current state or where most retailers are still today versus where the optimal state is. So in store, and I also think we need to separate the digital and the physical for a second here. In store, most retailers today are still relying on policy rules that they publish and then they request or ask that their employees enforce. Our view is that policies are rigid, they're brittle, easily overridden, and they create a significant amount of conflict in store. The other challenge is that policies, their rigid nature doesn't allow for any separation between a great consumer and a bad actor. And so you put a policy in place, a professional bad actor is going to figure out how to socially engineer their way to making a return in store with the associate. They understand them. They understand all the workarounds and all the flows and how to circumvent them. And so the people that really end up getting hurt by return policies are the good consumers. And that's really not in the best interest of retailers. When you get into the digital space, retailers have now started to implement this digitally, either through rules engines and their commerce systems or by licensing third parties that implement rules on their websites or in their call centers. The end result is not much different. If you attempt to make a return through a digital portal that has a rules engine in the background, that portal is doing exactly the same thing the associate is doing. And so it's pushing the consumer either back to the store or to the call center, both of which are easily socially engineered by professionals. And at the end of the day, you've just added a huge burden to the great consumer. So that's what's happening today. Our view of the world is that the best way to address this issue is through a single authorization engine that touches all channels, engages with the consumer across all the channels where the retailer operates, and does this on a consumer by consumer basis, and is able to then tailor the policies based on the consumer's total profile or value profile to the retailer, and clearly identifies professional organized criminals and stops them in their tracks. It also removes all of the decision process from the in-store associates, very much like other systems do today, where the associates are not able to override them, and it just removes all the conflict as well. The end result is that we see much higher satisfaction rates, and we actually see purchase after returns, meaning these consumers that make purchases after they do a return of good consumers increase where the solutions are put in place. And we see almost a 90% reduction in what we see as deliberate fraud activity. So it's a pretty powerful solution. It's simple to implement, meaning operationally, after all the implementations and integrations are done, and it's all AI driven. And so it allows us to do all kinds of special tailoring to the great consumers and deliver very unique experiences if the retailer wants to.
Interesting. It sounds like it's the returns version of the 360-degree view of the customer to some extent. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. To me, it's a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that, I'm thinking like, well, a rule is a rule and it's a rule throughout. But it sounds like what you're saying is it makes a lot more sense to, as you say, go customer by customer, talk about what are some of the factors actually that would go into, say, the rules engine, not the rules engine, treating one customer differently than another? What kind of KPIs or indicators would be important?
Yeah, so I like that point that you made, Adam, that, a rule is a rule. But the way I like to think about it, right, is imagine you're a retailer and your very best shopper is standing in front of you on day 32 trying to make a return, and you have a 30-day return policy. Would you not want to go ahead and still accept that return, right? Because it is your very best customer. And I think that's really a lot that goes into our models and our engine, right? We're bringing in data. We are connecting a lot of these transactions to identify a true 360-degree view of the shopper. And then our goal is to use that to create a more positive experience, right? How do we deliver the best possible returns experience while removing all of the fraud and abuse in the transaction? How do we add that intelligent friction just for the less than 1% of abusive and fraudulent shoppers while still preserving and actually in many, many cases improving the experience for the other 99%, right? Versus these hard, rigid rules that have a high insult and conflict rate when it comes to the way they are executed and implemented. So we're bringing some of the KPIs that we're looking at is around profitability, right? Their overall history of what are they buying and returning, right? Is there a significant pattern that we're seeing where, a lot of the returns that they're making are coming from products that have a high shrink rate or they're stolen more often from the stores, right? Are they using legitimate receipts, right? Because a lot of the times people believe that if you have a receipt, it has to be a legitimate return, but that's actually not the case, right? You could have stolen that receipt from the trash can right outside the store. Or these days you can print receipts at home. You could have ChatGPT make you a receipt for any retailer and you will get a legitimately valid looking receipt that you can go into your store or online and try to make a return. The other thing here to also think about is when we talk about returns and refunds, it goes beyond just you bought a product and you're returning it. We are also talking about things like claims and appeasements, right? So you could have ordered something and maybe it didn't arrive, right? So you would call the retailer and say, I didn't get this item, or a porch pirate stole this item, or it says delivered, but the package was missing, or a specific item was missing from the package, or maybe it was damaged. So there's a variety of these different scenarios that could happen. Now you add on top of that the complexity that this could happen in store, online, or you could be interacting with the retailer's call center. This becomes a really difficult problem to accurately measure and stop. And that's where using AI and using these models, we're able to build a unified engine that regardless of the point of entry or regardless of where you're experiencing this risk, we're able to give the same consistent decision, both to remove fraud and abuse, but also protect the good shoppers and make sure that they have a seamless experience.
So we talked about the great shoppers, Adam, and we talked about the bad actors, but there is a percentage of the population that, as we pointed out earlier in this conversation, whose behavior we have trained has changed. And so that percentage of the population has high return rates. They're not the best shoppers. And so they're adding a lot of margin erosion to retailers. And changing the behavior, gently changing the behavior of that population with adding a little bit of friction to the returns process is a key goal of ours. And so if you think about $685 billion in returns, that's $685 billion in missed sales, the associated margins, and it doesn't account for all the associated costs, frictional costs of handling, stocking, and shipping all of that product and handling it. So the other part of the population that we like to address, and we're working quite a bit with our customers on addressing, is slowly injecting a little bit of friction into that return by either providing a message on the return that, hey, your return has been approved. However, your next return may not be approved, for example. And so that is something that's actually patented that we own. It's called a warning on returns. And so what we see when we start injecting those small messages, or we see a up to 90% reduction in return behavior by that consumer with very little impact on their shopping patterns, which is optimal for the retailer, right? They're seeing sales continue from that consumer, but they're keeping the margin and the revenue from it. In the digital space, as Vishal pointed out with claims, if somebody is a frequent claimant, so for example, I live in a neighborhood, I have a store nearby, I'm dealing with an omni-channel retailer, rather than just decline the claim, we can encourage that consumer to pick up next shipment is only available to be picked up in store, or they should buy claim insurance or something along those lines in order to allow them to continue to have a great experience with the retailer. So that's really where it's changing. So listen, stopping fraud is table stakes. Any solution can stop fraud. However, they have to consider not impacting the good customer. You can't impact good customers while you're attempting to stop fraud. You can't be that very narrowly focused or myopic in your approach. The other part of it is really where the big money is reducing overall return rates from that portion of the population that has been re-educated in a bad way by the digital space. And so that's where we're facing or really focusing our time as well.
I love that idea of gently gliding people with, you might call it strategic or targeted friction. That's a great way to put it.
Let's call it the velvet ropes of return
The velvet ropes of returns. So what do they say? A diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to hell and make you look forward to the trip.
Exactly.
So maybe it's a little bit of like, as you say, we're taking this return, but we're watching you almost as part of it. But that's fascinating. And there must be a lot of consumer psychology that goes into creating these. You know, as you say, we've trained and educated a good chunk of the populace to just, returns are free and shipping's free and everything's free. And obviously that's not really tenable for the retail industry to keep doing its profit margins.
And I actually think, Adam, to your point, right, around the psychology of the consumer, I also think that when brands go full 180 to the other side, where they say, now we're going to charge a return fee for everybody, that also creates a very, very bad perception, right, for consumers. In fact, most stats suggest that, 70% of customers would not shop with a retailer if they have a bad returns experience, right? And similarly, 60% plus consumers check return policies. So again, it's always about how do we use data to create that intelligent decisions, and how do we use intelligent algorithms rather than static rules to create a more personalized and a better returns experience.
Yeah, we're making returns part of the total consumer engagement, right, with that brand. To Vishal's point, if we create a negative experience, we're reducing engagement and potentially losing the consumer. And the reason this is important, Adam, especially this giant piece of the population, is simple. Every time a retailer does a return, they're buying back their $685 billion of incidents where retailers are buying back their inventory used, okay? Depending how long the consumer hung on to the inventory, they may have to mark it down. And so that lowers top line sales and net sales, those returns. It has a massive impact on margin, and I already talked about the associated carrying costs. And then that insult to injury, when bad actors come in and steal product or return stolen product, it is a duplicative impact on the retailer's bottom line. I have had twice the impact on top line sales, and I've impacted shrink by that amount as well. So, and I'm literally using the retailer as an ATM to liquidate stolen product. They're literally buying back their own stolen product. So that's why we excel at stopping the fraud, but we also want to improve retailers' bottom line by letting them keep the dollars they've worked so hard to sell and put good products on the shelf. We see it, for example, depending on the retailer, we see behaviors where bulk professional returners will come in, wipe out a retailer of a new release of a product, go to a secondary channel and sell it. Okay, first of all, because they buy so much of it, they try to take advantage of every discount associated with multiple loyalty accounts. They create a secondary competitive channel to that retailer, sell the product, and then they're left over with the sizes they didn't want. So they come back and they socially engineer it to return the remaining inventory as non-receipted inventory, non-receipted returns, and they return it at full price. And so the retailer A sold it at a margin discount, B had a competitor that's undercutting them because they bought it less than the retail value. And C, they're now buying back the sizes they didn't want. All the while, that shelf was empty for the consumer that walked through the front door of that store that wanted to buy the product. So it's very, very important to have an omni-channel solution that sees all of these, the way every consumer or bad actor interacts with every single channel of the retailer. Doing single point solutions or implementing policies or rules, it just doesn't work.
So I understand Appriss Retail does a consumer returns report. I was wondering if there's any key data points that stood out to you guys or anything else from the report that you think adds to this. I mean, everything you've been saying, it sounds like returns fraud and abuse is on the rise. Does this put some numbers behind that?
Yeah, so that's kind of where we started with the data. So our consumer returns report is where we've pulled some of the statistics from. So $685 billion in total returns, $103 billion in abuse or fraud combined, 78% end up in a store. And so this disparity between the digital return dollars in omni-channel retailers and the outsized impact that as digital continues to grow, it continues to have an outsized impact on in-store returns. And as Vishal pointed out, the orphaned SKUs that show up at the store because the store just doesn't carry that line or something along those lines. So those are some of the good statistics. And Vishal quoted some of the other statistics around 70% of consumers will not shop at a brand where they had a bad return experience. And around 70% of consumers as well will investigate a retailer's return policy and decide against it if there's friction in that policy, like you have to buy insurance.
So we're coming near the end of our podcast. I guess I would wrap up by asking you, if you had to identify the most important tools and tactics for lowering return rates and costs, and again, without antagonizing customers, as it sounds like you've been talking about, it's not about saying no to people, it's about getting them to go in the right direction. So if someone was listening to the podcast and wanted a couple of takeaways, what would be your best advice, your elevator pitch, as it were?
Yeah, to me, the elevator pitch is take a holistic view of returns and claims, right? And that means make sure you have a single engine or a single set of rules or policies, if you want to still do that, which we vote against, across all three channels, and that they're looking at consumers holistically based on value and based on risk. Fraud is table stakes. Every solution should be able to stop fraud because it has recognizable patterns. And then really have a solution that helps you gently change the consumer behavior that has evolved over the past 10 years or so, and reduces returns overall without impacting your good customers. But first and foremost, do no harm to your good customers. That is rule number one. They're hard to come by.
Good point. Vishal, what's your take?
My take is always use data, because that's my background. So use data and use models where you can to really create a differentiated and a personalized experience, right? Whether it is removing fraud and abuse, or whether that is about giving the consumer or your shopper a really differentiated experience, right? And this could look in the form of pickup of returns from your home, right? For your best customers. So there's a lot that a retailer can do and deploy in terms of strategies to really create a differentiated returns experience. And it all starts with data and models.
Got it. All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. I'm so glad we got a chance to talk about this. It's a big and important topic. So thanks for joining us for this Retail Remix Deep Dive session. I would like to thank my guests, Vishal Patel and Pedro Ramos, as well as our sponsor, Appriss Retail. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Retail Remix. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Until next time, keep mixing it up.